The doors were 300 meters tall. They were made from a metal that humanity had never seen before, polished so perfectly that Ambassador David Nash could see his own reflection staring back at him. He looked small. He felt smaller. Behind those doors waited the Galactic Council. David took a deep breath and looked at his team. There were only 6 of them. 6 humans representing an entire world. Dr. Alinga Cruz stood to his left, Earth's leading xenobiologist and the calmest person he had ever met. Commander Robert Hayes was on his right, a military man who had spent 30 years preparing for threats that most people thought were science fiction. Behind them stood Marcus Webb, their communications expert, Dr. Aditi Rao, their physicist, and young Lieutenant Anna Foster, who was officially listed as a translator, but was actually one of Earth's best intelligence analysts. 6 humans. Against a civilization that ruled 1,000,000 worlds, the doors began to open and sound hit them like a physical wave. Thousands of voices. Millions of eyes. The chamber beyond was so vast that clouds had formed near its ceiling, and the far walls disappeared into a blue haze of distance. David Nash walked forward. The council chamber of the Galactic Assembly was not built for humans. It was not built for any single species. It was built to intimidate, to remind every visitor that they were small, temporary, and utterly dependent on the mercy of powers beyond their understanding. 12,000 species had sent representatives to this chamber. Some floated in anti-gravity fields. Others breathed through apparatus that hissed and clicked. Creatures of crystal and creatures, of shadow and creatures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3, all turned there. Attention to the 6 small figures walking down the central pathway. David kept his eyes forward. His heart was pounding so hard, he was certain the aliens could hear it dot at the end of the pathway. Rising like a mountain carved into a throne, sat the High Chancellor of the Galactic Assembly. His name was Vorax, and he belonged to a species called the Faxer. He was 12 feet tall, covered in ceremonial medals, and his compound eyes reflected David's image 1,000 times over. Vorax did not speak. He simply waited. David reached the speaking platform, a circle of light that hovered above the floor, and stepped onto it. The platform rose gently, carrying him up until he was level with the lowest tier of representatives. He was still far below the High Chancellor, but at least now the aliens did not have to look down quite so far. David activated his translator and spoke. High Chancellor Vorax, distinguished representatives of the Galactic Assembly, I am Ambassador David Nash, and I speak for the people of Earth. His voice echoed through the chamber, translated simultaneously into 10,000 languages. Vorax's mandibles clicked. The Terran species has been observed for 70 of your solar cycles. You have developed faster-than-light travel without authorization. You have expanded beyond your home system without permission. You have violated 17 provisions of the Galactic Compact before even knowing it existed. A murmur ran through the chamber. Some of it sounded like laughter. The punishment for these violations, Vorax continued, is severe. Your species must accept probationary status. Your expansion will be halted. Your technology will be restricted. You will submit to oversight from the Assembly for a period of no less than 1,000 standard cycles. 1,000 years. David felt the weight of those words pressing down on him, but he did not show it. High Chancellor, David said, his voice steady, I have a question before we discuss these terms. Vorax's eyes narrowed. You are not in a position to ask questions, Ambassador. Nevertheless, David reached into his diplomatic pouch, moving slowly so that the countless weapons pointed at him would not fire. He withdrew a small device and held it up. This is a data crystal containing records of every species that has accepted probationary status in the last 3,000 years. We obtained it from public archives that your own assembly maintains. The chamber went quiet. 347 species have accepted these terms, David continued. And of those 347 species, do you know how many successfully completed their probationary period and became full members of the assembly? Silence, 0. David let the word hang in the air. Not one. Every single species that accepted probationary status was eventually found guilty of additional violations. Some were reduced to a single continent. Others were forbidden from space travel forever. 14 species no longer exist at all. The murmuring returned, but now it had a different quality. Some of the smaller delegations were shifting uncomfortably. High Chancellor Vorix, David said, we are not fools. We understand that we are small and weak compared to the powers assembled in this chamber. We understand that you could destroy us without effort. But we also understand something else. This assembly does not offer new species a chance to prove themselves. It offers them a slow execution. Vorix rose from his throne, his massive form casting a shadow across the entire speaking platform. You dare to accuse this assembly of corruption? I accuse nothing, David replied. I simply present facts, and I offer an alternative. He looked out at the 12,000 delegations, knowing that most of them would happily watch Earth burn. But he also knew that some of them, the smaller species, the ones who had been crushed under the assembly's heel for millennia, might be thinking different thoughts. Humanity does not ask for power, David said. We do not ask for special treatment. We ask only for a fair chance. And we propose this. Instead of probationary status, grant us conditional observation. Allow neutral parties to monitor our actions. Let our behavior speak for itself. And if we violate your laws, judge us then based on evidence, not on predictions. Vorix laughed. It was a terrible sound, like metal scraping against stone. You think you can negotiate with us? You think you have any leverage at all? David smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. High Chancellor, in the last 24 hours, my team has spoken with 112 delegations in this chamber. Most of them refused to meet with us, but 43 of them did. And of those 43, 37 have agreed to formally request that the Assembly consider our proposal. The chamber exploded into chaos. 30-7 species supporting humanity. It was nothing compared to 12,000, but it was more than any new species had ever achieved on their first day before the Assembly. David Nash stood on the speaking platform, watching the High Chancellor's compound eyes flicker with something that might have been surprise, and waited for the galaxy to decide humanity's fate. He knew the battle was just beginning, but he had done something that no human had ever done before. He had shown the galaxy that Earth would not be an easy victim, and in the corridors of power, in the shadows where ancient species plotted and schemed, that message was being received very clearly indeed. 3 months had passed since humanity's first appearance before the Galactic Assembly, and Ambassador David Nash had learned one crucial truth. The galaxy did not forgive. The 37 species who had supported Earth's proposal were now facing consequences. Trade agreements were being canceled. Diplomatic privileges were being revoked. The message from the major powers was clear. Support the humans and suffer. David stood in his quarters aboard the diplomatic station, staring at the stars through a window made of transparent metal. Earth was out there somewhere, a pale blue dot that most of the galaxy considered already dead. They were just waiting for humanity to understand its fate. His door chimed. Dr. Elena Cruz entered, her face tight with concern. Behind her came Commander Hayes and Lieutenant Foster. We have a problem, Cruz said. David turned from the window. Another one? A significant one. Cruz activated a holographic display. An image appeared showing a Faxer diplomat named Ambassador Raylox. Ambassador Relox has filed formal charges against humanity. He claims that we have been conducting illegal surveillance on Faxer communications. David frowned. Have we? Commander Hayes stepped forward. No. Our intelligence operations have been extremely careful. We have not touched any Faxer systems. Then the charges are false. Obviously. Hayes crossed his arms. But that does not matter. The Faxer control the investigation bureau. They will find whatever evidence they want to find. And when they do, humanity will be found guilty of espionage. The punishment for espionage is immediate termination of diplomatic status. Our entire delegation will be expelled. And without diplomatic protection, Earth becomes a legitimate military target. The room fell silent. Lieutenant Foster spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. Sir, I have been analyzing the timing of these charges. They were filed exactly 48 hours after the Korath delegation expressed interest in a trade agreement with Earth. David looked at her. The Korath? The mining species? Yes, sir. They control the largest mineral deposits in this sector. If humanity had access to their resources, we could accelerate our technological development significantly. The Faxer cannot allow that. David understood. The false charges were not about surveillance. They were about control. The Faxer were sending a message to every species in the assembly. Work with humans, and we will destroy you. He sat down heavily in his chair. How long do we have before the investigation concludes? 30 days, Cruz replied. Maybe less if they decide to rush things. 30 days to prove their innocence against a rigged system. 30 days to save Earth. David looked at his team, at the people who had given up everything to stand with him on the edge of the abyss. They were tired. They were afraid, but they were not broken. We cannot win a fight against the Investigation Bureau, David said slowly. They will manufacture whatever evidence they need. So we need to change the game. We need to give the Assembly something they cannot ignore. Hayes leaned forward. What do you have in mind? David thought about the Assembly chamber. 12,000 species. Most of them hostile. But not all. Some of the smaller delegations had approached him quietly in the months since his speech. They had spoken of old grievances, of promises broken by the major powers, of hope that anyone, might finally stand up to the system. The Faxer have been running this assembly for 6,000 years, David said. In that time, they have made enemies. Lots of enemies. The difference between those enemies and us is simple. They are afraid, and we have nothing left to lose. He stood up and walked to his console, pulling up files that his team had been compiling for months. Lieutenant Foster, I need a complete list of every species that has been wronged by the Faxer. Every broken treaty. Every unfair judgment. Every act of bullying that was never punished. Foster nodded and began working immediately. Commander Hayes, I need you to reach out to your contacts in the military attaché corps. Find out which species have been quietly building their own capabilities. Which ones are tired of being pushed around. Hayes smiled grimly. There are more than you might think. Dr. Cruz, I need you to focus on the scientific delegations. Scientists talk to each other across species lines. Find out what they know about Faxer vulnerabilities. What they fear. What they hide. Cruz nodded. I have already made some friends in the biology section. They trust me. David looked at each of them in turn. We have 30 days. In that time, we are going to build something that has never existed in this assembly. A coalition of the overlooked. The ignored. The crushed. We are going to give them a reason to stand with us. Marcus Webb, who had been silent until now, spoke up. And if we fail? If the coalition does not form in time? David did not hesitate. Then we go down fighting. But we do not go down quietly. We make sure that every species in this galaxy remembers what humanity was willing to do for freedom. We make sure that the next species the Faxer tries to crush thinks twice. We leave a legacy. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Hayes nodded. Good enough for me. The next 30 days were the most intense of David Nash's life. He slept 4 hours a night. He met with dozens of delegations, some openly and some in secret. He listened to their grievances, their fears, their hopes. And slowly, carefully, he began to weave them together. The Koroth, the mining species, were the first to commit. They had been paying tribute to the Faxer for 2,000 years, and they were tired. The Velani, a peaceful species of empaths, joined next. They had watched the Faxer destroy 3 of their sister species, and they had lived in fear ever since. The Brindi, the Molex, the Orani, one by one, species that had never spoken to each other began to speak, and on the 29th day, Lieutenant Foster burst into David's quarters with news that changed everything. "Sir," she said, breathing hard, "I found something. The surveillance data the Faxer claim we stole, it does not exist. They fabricated the charges so quickly that they made a mistake. The timestamps on their evidence are impossible. The data they say we stole was created after the date they claim we stole it." David stared at her. "You can prove this?" "I can prove it beyond any doubt. The Faxer tried to frame us, and they got sloppy." David Nash smiled. For the first time in months, he felt something that he had almost forgotten. Hope. "Call the coalition," he said. "All of them. Tomorrow, we go before the assembly, and we show them exactly what kind of game the Faxer have been playing. The battle for Earth's survival was about to enter its next phase, and the galaxy was about to learn that humans were far more dangerous than they appeared." The assembly chamber fell into absolute silence as Lieutenant Anna Foster finished presenting her evidence. Every screen in that vast space displayed the same damning information, timestamps that proved the Faxer had fabricated their surveillance charges, dates that did not match, files that could not exist. Ambassador David Nash stood on the speaking platform and watched the Faxer delegation. High Chancellor Vorix had not moved. His compound eyes were fixed on the evidence, and his mandibles were perfectly still. For the first time since humanity had entered this chamber, the Faxer had nothing to say. The silence stretched on for 10 seconds, 20, 30, and then a sound began to rise from the lower tiers of the assembly, from the delegations that had been ignored and overlooked for millennia. It was not applause. It was something deeper. It was the sound of species finally daring to believe that the untouchable might be touched. Vorix rose from his throne, his massive form casting shadows across half the chamber. "These claims are absurd," he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of contempt. "The humans have clearly manipulated this data to serve their own purposes. David had expected this. Then let us submit the evidence to independent verification. Let us have neutral parties examine every file, every timestamp, every piece of data. If humanity has manipulated anything, they will find it. That will not be necessary." Vorix's eyes swept across the chamber, and his voice took on a dangerous edge. "This assembly has more important matters to discuss than the desperate lies of a dying species." He was trying to bury it. David had known he would try, but he had also prepared for this moment. "High Chancellor," David said, "under Article 177 of the Assembly Charter, any member species may call for a vote of transparency when evidence of corruption is presented. I am calling for that vote now." Vorix froze. Article 177 was ancient. It had not been invoked in over 4,000 years. Most species had forgotten it existed, but Lieutenant Foster had found it buried in the Assembly's own archives, and it was still valid law. A vote of transparency would force an independent investigation. It would open the Faxer's records to scrutiny. It would expose every dirty secret they had accumulated over 6 millennia of rule, and it would destroy them. Vorax's mandibles clicked rapidly. You cannot invoke Article 177. Your species has not been granted full membership. You have no standing to call for votes. David smiled. You are correct. Humanity cannot call for this vote. He turned to face the lower tiers, where his coalition waited. But our allies can. The Korath ambassador rose. She was a massive creature, her body covered in plates of living stone, her voice like grinding boulders. The Korath collective calls for a vote of transparency. The Vellani ambassador rose next. He was small and delicate, his skin shifting colors with his emotions. The Vellani Accord seconds this call. One by one, the coalition species stood. The Brindi, the Moliks, the Arani, 47 delegations rising in unison, their voices joining together in a demand that echoed through the chamber. Vorax watched in fury as his control began to slip, but the Thaxer had not ruled the galaxy for 6,000 years by being stupid. As the coalition's voices faded, Vorax raised one massive limb for silence. Very well, he said, his voice dangerously calm. If you wish to play these games, then we shall play them properly. I invoke the right of challenge. The chamber went cold. David did not know what the right of challenge meant, but from the expressions on his coalition's faces, it was nothing good. The Korath ambassador actually stepped backward, her stone plates grinding with alarm. The right of challenge, Vorax explained. His eyes fixed on David, allows any accused party to demand proof of standing. Your coalition claims to support humanity, but talk is cheap. Words mean nothing. He descended from his throne, his footsteps shaking the floor. If your coalition truly believes in its cause, let them prove it. Let each species that supports humanity accept shared responsibility for human actions. If humanity is found guilty of any crime in the future, every coalition member will share in the punishment. The chamber erupted in murmurs. This was a brilliant move. Vorax was forcing the coalition to choose, abandon humanity or risk their own survival. David watched his allies. The Vellani ambassador was trembling. The Moliks delegation was already whispering among themselves. Even the mighty Korath seemed uncertain. 40-7 species. 47 chances for the coalition to collapse. Commander Hayes appeared at David's side. This is bad, he muttered. They will abandon us. Self-preservation is universal. David said nothing. He was watching the Korath ambassador, watching her stone plates shift and grind as she processed the situation. She had been the first to join the coalition. She had been the bravest. And now she was being asked to risk everything. The Korath ambassador turned to face her own delegation. They spoke in low rumbles, their language too deep for human ears to fully capture. The debate lasted nearly a minute. Then she turned back to face Vorax. The Korath collective, she said, her voice steady, accepts shared responsibility. The chamber gasped. The Vellani ambassador closed his eyes, his skin cycling through colors of fear and determination. Then he spoke. The Vellani Accord also accepts. One by one, David's allies made their choice. Some hesitated. Some argued among themselves. But in the end, every single species that had risen to support humanity stayed standing. 47 species, risking their own existence to stand with Earth. Vorax stared at them in disbelief. This was not supposed to happen. Species were supposed to be selfish. They were supposed to value their own survival above all else. That was how the Thaxer had controlled them for so long, but something had changed. Humanity had shown them a different possibility. Not the possibility of power, but the possibility of unity. The possibility of standing together against tyranny. Even when it cost something. David Nash looked at the High Chancellor of the Galactic Assembly and spoke 3 simple words. Your move. Vorix, the Thaxer leader, was silent for a long moment. Then his mandibles clicked in what might have been a dark laugh. You think you have won something here today. You think this little display of solidarity changes anything. But you are wrong. He turned and began ascending back to his throne. The vote of transparency will proceed. But remember this, humans. We have ruled this galaxy since before your species learned to walk upright. We have crushed empires that would make your entire civilization look like a footnote. You have delayed us. Nothing more. He settled onto his throne and looked down at the 6 humans on the speaking platform. Enjoy your victory while you can. It will be your last. The session ended. But as David and his team left the chamber, surrounded by their unlikely allies, he knew that the war was far from over. The Thaxer would strike back. They would find new ways to attack, new strategies to divide and destroy. But for the first time, they were facing something they had never encountered before. A coalition that refused to break, and that terrified them more than any weapon ever could. The explosion ripped through the Korath embassy at exactly midnight station time. Fire bloomed in the darkness of space, debris spinning outward in a deadly spiral. And Ambassador David Nash felt his blood run cold as he watched it happen from his quarters half a kilometer away. 37 Korath diplomats had been inside that building. 37 members of humanity's most important ally. Commander Hayes burst through the door seconds later. Emergency stations. The Thaxer are claiming this was an accident. A fuel cell malfunction. David was already moving, pulling on his diplomatic uniform with shaking hands. It was not an accident. No, Hayes's face was grim. It was a message. The next 12 hours were chaos. Emergency responders from a dozen species worked to find survivors. Medical teams treated the wounded. And throughout it all, the Thaxer Investigation Bureau was everywhere, taking statements, collecting evidence, controlling the narrative. By morning, 18 Korath diplomats were confirmed dead. Among them was Ambassador Krella, the stone-skinned warrior who had been the first to stand with humanity. David stood in the ruins of the embassy, surrounded by twisted metal and broken stone, and felt a grief so deep it threatened to drown him. Krella had trusted him. She had risked everything for him. And now she was gone. Dr. Cruz appeared beside him. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. David, we need to talk. They moved to a secure location, a small room that their team had checked for surveillance devices. Lieutenant Foster was already there, her fingers flying across a data terminal. I have been analyzing the explosion patterns, Foster said without looking up. The fuel cell theory is impossible. The blast originated from inside the embassy, not from the fuel storage area. Someone planted a device. Can you prove it? David asked. Not yet. The Thaxer are controlling all access to the evidence. But I found something else. She pulled up an image on her screen. 3 hours before the explosion, a Thaxer maintenance worker entered the Korath embassy. He was logged in by the station's security systems, but when I cross-referenced with Korath internal records, no such maintenance was scheduled. David stared at the image. The worker's face was partially obscured, but his Thaxer body structure was unmistakable. They did it. They murdered our allies and made it look like an accident. And they will get away with it, Hayes said bitterly. They control the investigation. They control the evidence. By the time anyone questions their conclusions, the galaxy will have moved on. The room fell silent. Outside, David could hear the sounds of recovery efforts continuing. Species that had never worked together were cooperating to save Korath lives. The tragedy had brought them together in ways that diplomacy never could, and suddenly, David understood. They made a mistake, he said slowly. The others looked at him. The Thaxer wanted to frighten our coalition. They wanted to show that supporting humanity leads to death. But they miscalculated. David walked to the window, looking out at the recovery teams. They killed one of the most beloved ambassadors in the assembly. They destroyed an embassy that was supposed to be protected by galactic law. And they did it so clumsily that anyone with intelligence can see through their lies. He turned back to his team. They did not weaken our coalition. They gave us martyrs. Dr. Cruz nodded slowly. The smaller species are already talking. The Velani are furious. The Maleks have publicly demanded an independent investigation. Even some of the neutral species are starting to ask questions. This is our moment, David said. We need to act now, before the Thaxer can spin their narrative. We need to show the galaxy exactly what happened here. And we need to do it in a way they cannot ignore. Hayes frowned. How? The Thaxer control all official communication channels. Any message we send will be blocked or distorted. Lieutenant Foster looked up from her terminal. Not all channels. There is one that they cannot control. She pulled up a new display showing a complex network of interconnected nodes. The Merchant Network. It is an informal communication system used by traders across the galaxy. It is decentralized. It is encrypted. And it reaches almost every inhabited world. David studied the network. Can we use it? The Korath can. Foster's voice was quiet. Their trading houses have access to every node in the network. And right now, every Korath in the galaxy is mourning their ambassador and looking for answers. David felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Contact the surviving Korath diplomats. Tell them we have evidence. Tell them we need their help to spread it. The next 48 hours were a blur of activity. Foster worked around the clock to compile evidence, creating a presentation that was impossible to deny. Cruz coordinated with sympathetic scientists who could verify the technical claims. Hayes reached out to military contacts who could confirm the maintenance worker's identity. And David did what he did best. He talked. He met with grieving Korath families and shared their pain. He sat with frightened Velani diplomats and gave them courage. He visited every coalition member who would see him, and he reminded them why they had chosen to stand with humanity. On the third day, the evidence went out. It spread through the merchant network like fire through dry grass. Within hours, billions of beings across the galaxy were watching the same presentation. The impossible fuel cell theory, the mysterious maintenance worker, the Thaxer's clumsy cover dash-up. The High Chancellor tried to contain it. He issued official denials. He blocked communication nodes. He threatened sanctions against anyone who spread what he called human propaganda. But it was too late. The truth was out. And then something remarkable happened. Species that had never joined the coalition began to speak up. The Fanari, a race of traders who had stayed neutral for centuries, publicly demanded accountability. The Moxer, ancient beings who had not addressed the assembly in living memory, emerged from their isolation to express concern. Even some species that had previously supported the Thaxer began to question their leadership. Vorax called an emergency session of the assembly. When David entered the chamber, he found it transformed. The lower tiers, once subdued and fearful, were buzzing with angry conversation. The upper tiers, where the major powers sat, were unnaturally quiet. The High Chancellor rose, his compound eyes sweeping across the chaos. "Order," he commanded. "There will be order." Slowly, reluctantly, the chamber fell silent. Vorax spoke, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority. "The accusations being spread through unofficial channels are lies. The Korath embassy was destroyed by a tragic accident. Humanity and their allies are using this tragedy to sow discord. This assembly will not be manipulated." David stepped onto the speaking platform. Then submit to an independent investigation. Let neutral parties examine the evidence. If we are wrong, prove it. Vorax's mandibles clicked. The investigation is already complete. The conclusions are final. Final according to whom? According to the Thaxer? David gestured at the chamber around him. How many species in this room trust that conclusion? How many truly believe that the most capable engineers in the galaxy somehow allowed a fuel cell to explode in the heart of a protected embassy? No one answered. But the silence itself was an answer. We do not ask you to take our word, David continued. We ask only for transparency, for truth, for the kind of justice that this assembly was supposed to represent. He looked directly at Vorax. Unless, of course, you have something to hide. The chamber held its breath. Vorax stared down at the human, who had caused him more trouble than any species in 6,000 years. And in his ancient eyes, something shifted. He was not defeated. He was not surrendering. But he was, for the first time, reconsidering. Very well, he said finally. A new investigation will be conducted. And when it proves that humanity has been lying, the consequences will be severe. David Nash smiled. It was not a victory. Not yet. But it was another step. Another crack in the wall of Thaxer power. And in the shadows of the chamber, watching through 100 different eyes, the galaxy was finally starting to wonder, what if the humans were right? The independent investigation took 60 days. It was conducted by 3 species that had no alliance with either the Thaxer or humanity. The Ves, ancient beings of pure energy. The Calaxi, impartial logicians who had served as judges for 10,000 years. And the Remnari, historians who valued truth above all else. Ambassador David Nash waited in his quarters as the final report was prepared. He had not slept in 36 hours. None of his team had. They had spent 2 months watching the investigation unfold, feeding information to the investigators when they could, praying that the truth would be enough. Commander Hayes entered without knocking. His face told David everything he needed to know. They found it, Hayes said. Everything. The planted explosive. The identity of the saboteur. The direct orders from Thaxer High Command. David closed his eyes. How bad? Complete. The Thaxer murdered the Korath ambassador to destabilize our coalition. There is no room for interpretation. No alternative explanation. They are guilty. For a long moment, David said nothing. He had known this was coming. He had suspected from the beginning. But hearing it confirmed, knowing that 18 innocent beings had died because of a power play, was still devastating. When does the assembly convene? He asked. 1 hour. David stood and straightened his uniform. His hands were steady. His heart was not. Then let us finish this. The assembly chamber was packed beyond capacity. Species that normally sent 1 or 2 representatives had dispatched entire delegations. The observation galleries, usually empty, were crowded with journalists, historians, and ordinary citizens from 1,000 worlds. Everyone understood that this session would change history. David Nash walked down the central pathway for what might be the last time. His team followed behind him, their faces showing the exhaustion of months of struggle. Dr. Cruz, Commander Hayes, Marcus Webb, Dr. Rao, and Lieutenant Foster. 6 humans who had refused to break. High Chancellor Vorax sat on his throne, surrounded by his own advisors. His compound eyes tracked David's approach with undisguised hatred. But there was something else in those eyes now. Something that David had never seen before. Fear got the lead investigator. A Calaxi elder named Siren rose to present the findings. Her voice was calm, clinical, and utterly devastating. She described how Thaxer agents had infiltrated the Korath embassy. She detailed the precise mechanism of the explosive device. She presented communications between Thaxer commanders discussing the operation. And she concluded with a single damning statement. The destruction of the Koroth embassy was a deliberate act of murder, planned and executed by the government of the Faxer Dominion. This was not an accident. This was not a misunderstanding. This was an assassination designed to weaken a legitimate diplomatic coalition and to prevent the exposure of Faxer corruption. The chamber erupted. Species that had been silent for centuries were shouting. Delegations that had always supported the Faxer were backing away in disgust. Even some Faxer representatives were staring at their own leaders in horror. Vorax rose from his throne, his massive form trembling with rage. These accusations are false. The investigators have been corrupted by human influence. This is a conspiracy to destroy the greatest civilization in galactic history. Siren did not flinch. The evidence speaks for itself. All data has been made available to any species that wishes to verify our findings. The truth is undeniable. Vorax turned to face the assembly, spreading his limbs in a gesture of appeal. You cannot believe this. Humanity has manipulated you all. They are the threat. They are the ones who should be punished. But no one was listening anymore. David stepped onto the speaking platform and raised his hand for silence. Slowly, gradually, the chamber calmed. 12,000 species turned their attention to the small human who had started it all. High Chancellor Vorax, David said, you asked me once if I understood my position. You asked if I knew how small and weak humanity was compared to the powers of this galaxy. And you were right. We are small. We are weak. We arrived here with nothing but hope and determination. He paused, letting his words sink in. But you made a mistake. You assumed that size and power were the same thing. You assumed that species could be controlled through fear forever. You assumed that no one would ever stand up to you, because standing up was too dangerous. David looked out at the thousands of delegations watching him. At the Koroth, who had lost their beloved ambassador, but not their courage. At the Velani, whose gentle nature had proven stronger than anyone expected. At all the small, overlooked species who had finally found their voices. Humanity did not defeat the Faxer, David said. We simply showed others that defeat was possible. We lit a spark. It was the galaxy itself that became the fire. He turned back to Vorax. You have ruled through fear for 6,000 years. But fear only works as long as everyone is afraid. And you taught them not to be. Every threat you made, every punishment you inflicted, every murder you committed, showed the galaxy exactly what you were. And now they are no longer willing to accept it. The chamber was absolutely silent. Then the Koroth ambassador, a young female named Grella, who had taken over after Krella's death, rose from her delegation. The Koroth Collective calls for a vote of no confidence in High Chancellor Vorax and the Faxer Dominion's leadership of this assembly. The Valani rose. The Malaks rose. The Irani rose. One by one, delegations that had never dared to challenge the established order stood and added their voices. And then something unexpected happened. The Fenari rose. The Moxer rose. Species that had been neutral, species that had even supported the Faxer, began to stand. David watched in amazement as the wave grew. 100 delegations. 500. 1,000. More and more species rising, their voices joining together in a chorus that shook the foundations of the chamber. When it was over, more than 7,000 delegations stood in opposition to Faxer rule. It was not unanimous. The major powers and their closest allies remained seated. But it was enough. More than enough. Vorax looked at the sea of opposition surrounding him, and for the first time in his very long life, he understood that his reign was over. This is not finished, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This will never be finished. He turned and walked off the dais, followed by his remaining supporters. The Thaxer Dominion would not fall in a day. There would be resistance, perhaps even conflict, in the years to come. But their absolute control was broken, and in the center of the chamber, surrounded by allies he never expected to have, Ambassador David Nash allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten. Pride, not in himself, not in humanity alone, but in what they had all accomplished together. Small species standing against tyranny. Overlooked voices finally being heard. A galaxy that had accepted injustice for millennia, finally deciding that enough was enough. Dr. Cruz appeared at his side, tears streaming down her face. "We did it, David. We actually did it." David put his arm around her shoulder. "No, they did it. We just showed them it was possible." Around them, the chamber was still in chaos. But it was a different kind of chaos now. Delegations were meeting, forming new connections, discussing a future that had seemed impossible just months ago. For the first time in 6,000 years, the galaxy was truly changing. Lieutenant Foster approached with a message. "Sir, we have just received word from Earth. The broadcast of these proceedings was transmitted across all human colonies." Everyone saw what happened. She paused, her voice catching. "They are proud of us." David looked up at the ceiling of the great chamber, at the clouds that formed near its top, at the impossible scale of what humanity had entered and somehow survived. Humanity was still small. Humanity was still new. There would be challenges ahead, enemies who would try to push back, a galaxy that was still learning how to be free. But they had proven something today, something that would echo across the stars for generations to come. The galaxy had thought humans would fall. They had expected Earth to crumble, to submit, to become just another cautionary tale in the long history of failed species. But humanity had realized something their Thaxer never understood. True power was not about size or strength or weapons. True power was about standing together, about refusing to be broken, about lighting sparks in the darkness and trusting others to fan them into flames. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had helped it remember what it could be, and that was worth more than any empire.